Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Aristotle and Antisthenes. So you've probably heard of Aristotle. He's the founder of the Lyceum, which is, we still have the name Lycée, which is a form of school in French. And he's also considered one of the fathers of Western philosophy. Him and Plato are sort of both given that title. His name actually means best purpose, so maybe we can see how that might make sense throughout his life. He has a huge influence on everything from physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, theater, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, government. So I'll try to cover as much of these as possible with a certain mindfulness of the time it might take, but obviously a huge influence, and not only on within his own lifetime, but also throughout history. I think a lot of it said even our intellectual lexicon even came from Aristotle, so even our most of the words we use were derived from his ideas and his philosophies. So yeah, I suppose we'll start off with his life. So he was born in what's called Stagira, which is in sort of central Macedonia, which is in modern day Greece. His father's name was Nicomachean, and he died when he was about 13. But nonetheless, as we'll see, he did have some sort of an influence on him. But his father was generally a pretty important person for the Macedonian kingdom. His father was the physician for King Amiates, who was Philip II of Macedon's father. And Philip II was the father of Alexander the Great. So his father was essentially the physician for the royal family. And he was later, at the age of 13, he was given a guardian, and later when he was about 17 or 18, he was sent to Athens to study under Plato. So it sort of seems as though, and I think this is true as well, that he was sort of being, from a young age, sort of being brought up to be a sort of counselor or teacher to the royal family of Macedon, or Macedonia. And during this time, Macedonia was getting very, very powerful, and there was also, within Athens, there was sort of a negative sentiment towards the Macedonians because they were getting very powerful, and under Philip II's rule, he becomes de facto, or Philip II became de facto leader of Athens, so obviously they were quite upset there, and ultimately when Alexander the Great comes there, became king, it sort of solidified their power over Athens. So he studied at Plato's academy until about the age of 37, when around the time when Plato died, and he did not really have much confidence in this heir to the academy, Plato's nephew. So he left, and he went supposedly, he traveled around, which is sort of a common theme amongst many of these great philosophers and great thinking. I think not only is it important, or was it important in terms of spreading their own ideas, but I also think it was important in accumulating their own personal knowledge, so I think it was sort of necessary. It's said that he took part in what's called the Eleusinian Mysteries. So I've mentioned this in a few videos before. The Eleusinian Mysteries, as the name alludes to, is they were mysteries. So they're kind of like these agrarian rituals, and supposedly many of them were experimented with psychedelics or something of the sort, but it was largely kept secret. But it was very common amongst the intellectuals to do it. Supposedly also Plato, for example, was likely to have attended these Eleusinian Mysteries. And from that, he says, 2 experiences to learn. So something happened, but I don't think it was necessarily as they didn't have contacts with the gods or any demigods, but I think it was sort of a mind-opening experience that they all partook in, and supposedly Aristotle was one of these. So yeah, so he was disappointed with Plato's nephew, whose name was Speusippus, and he And also, another reason he probably left Athens at this time, at the age of 37, was also the growing anti-Macedonian sentiment. So he was starting to get a little uncomfortable, and being a Macedonian loyalist, he thought it was time to leave. So he follows Xenocrates, who is also pretty famous philosopher as well, to Asia Minor, where he supposedly learned a lot of these great ideas. And Xenocrates was also a student of Plato, so they probably were had a good time talking a lot of philosophy on this journey. And following this, he took his own personal student, Theophrastes, to Lesbos, which is an island in Greece, to study botany. And many of the things we will be discussing came from this period. He married also during this time a woman named Phistias, and they had a daughter who had the same name, Phistias. Supposedly later when he died, he had another wife with a concubine who was born in the same city as he was. So I'm not sure, it's not told whether it was a love relationship or not, but it would have been kind of uncommon for someone of his fame at the time to marry or to have a child with a concubine, so somewhat of a little bit scandalous on Aristotle's part. So following this, when he's requested, or Philip II requests that Aristotle become the personal teacher of his son Alexander, who ultimately becomes Alexander the Great, who takes over pretty much all the at the time the developed world. And it said in Plutarch's Lives that he extolled certain ideas that could not even be shared in writing. In fact, even Alexander, when ultimately many of Aristotle's ideas were put into writing and given to the public, Alexander was sort of upset because he was giving away his competitive advantage. But he pretty much they agreed on everything but one thing. And as I say, with a lot of these people, although many of their ideas were great and well ahead of their time, you can't just agree with everything they say. And this is something that I disagree with with regards to Aristotle, and as did Alexander, and that eventually led to the gap between them. So here's a quote from him: "A leader to the Greeks and a despot to the barbarians, to look after the former as after friends and relatives, and to deal with the latter as with beasts or plants." So Aristotle was a bit of a racist, he thought, especially when he wanted Alexander, because Aristotle was a big supporter of war and big supporter of conquering. He thought that the Persians should be treated not as humans and be treated, as he says here, as beasts or plants, whereas Alexander actually conquered them, but he treated them as people and treated them as his subjects. So that's what ultimately led to the divide and between Alexander and Aristotle. And Aristotle was sort of angry at Alexander's treatment, but I think Alexander did the better thing here and proved to be at least the better force for humanity. And yeah, just obviously that just because Aristotle might have been a racist, that doesn't mean that all of his ideas weren't obviously brilliant. But I think it's important to note, and it's important to also address the negative aspects of their character in conjunction with the positives. That is something that Plutarch very adamantly believes as well. So after, later at this time, he produces what's called the Lyceum, which is a sort of the next great school after the Academy, which Plato created, and he spends most of his time through lectures and dialogues. But unlike the previous philosophers such as Socrates or Plato, he actually made sure that many of the ideas, not only his own ideas but other ideas, got into writing. Unfortunately, it's said that only about a third of his ideas probably exist to this day, but nonetheless, that was still a great feat, and there's still a plethora of information, and even a third seems to be quite a sufficient amount. For an example, and I'll get to this later, but for example, his thoughts on botany. It's said that he, or some people, unduly or misrepresent him as neglecting plants, but it's just that his writings on plants haven't lasted and his writings on animals have. So it's not that he neglected the plants, and that can be seen through his student whose writings still exist on plants, and they studied together in Lesbos, the island. So so he's taught at the Lyceum for about 12 years, and at that time he had the fallout with Alexander and with regards to his treatment of Persians, and eventually when Alexander ultimately dies, he is forced to flee from Athens, and this is because there was a lot of anti-Athenian sentiment, and they supposedly he almost got borderline killed by the Athenians because they sort of wanted to push out the Macedonians, and they feared that another leader would take them over. But also the Macedonian Empire was sort of in shambles, and they sort of they did not know who would be in charge of the great empire that Alexander left, even though, and even more so, Aristotle was a teacher of both Ptolemy and Cassander, who ultimately at one point become kings of the Macedonian Empire. So either way, he is pushed to leave, and he has this quote, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy," being that he would not allow the Athenians to kill him. And I think this is where he very much differs from Socrates, where Socrates was willing to give his life to keep teaching and to actually even probably prove a lesson in its own right, whereas Aristotle's sort of threw in the towel. He said, okay, I'm not going to kill myself for this, I'm going to sort of just leave. And that's what he did. And yeah, he had a couple more children, and yeah, I suppose we can start talking about his philosophy, and there's lots to cover here. So in terms of logic, so he wrote 6 books on logic, and they're largely related to syllogism, which is sort of deductive reasoning. So for example, man is mortal, or for example, all dogs are mortal, and all mortal things die, therefore all dogs die. So intersect. So if you know any statistics. So that's just an example of syllogism. And these were obviously things that people thought and people knew in their heads, but no one actually sort of wrote it down in paper and sort of actually explicitly stated it. In terms of these 6 books on logic, he wrote a book on categories, a book on interpretation, a book on prior analytics, a book on posterior analytics, and a book on topics, and a book on sophistical refutations. So if you're interested in following any of these, they could be useful. Could be actually probably mostly useful for example, standardized tests. If you really master some of these, you do very well on your SATs or LSAT or GMAT or whatever it is, because these are principles that have lasted till this day. So those would be useful reading if you're interested. In terms of epistemology, so one of the reasons why I think he achieved greatness was that he was willing to contrast his own teacher, that being Plato. So if he had just been another copycat, another copy of version of Plato, then he probably wouldn't have achieved greatness, but he did this very much in his own right. So one of the main reasons that they differed was that Plato thought that there was the universal meaning of the world, and or like of an object, and the object itself. So for example, there is the universal concept of red, and there's the universal concept of apple, but the apple in front of you is a separate thing, whereas Aristotle thought they are one and the same thing. So he actually managed to, or attempted to, contrast his own teacher. In terms of metaphysics, he wrote the this book. Supposedly the word metaphysics did not even exist during Aristotle's time. His actual book is called First Philosophy, but retroactively it has been called Metaphysics. And he believed that science, and it did not apply to science or physics or theology. It was sort of the concept of matter and form. So, for example, Hercules pushed that everything is constant changing, so the man never steps in the same river twice, whereas Parmenides believed that change cannot be proven because nothing can move. In order for something to change, the Parmenidean one must move into the void, and since the void does not exist, change is impossible. So Aristotle, like many of the others who came after Hercules and Parmenides, he actually sort of disagreed with both, but he thought, for example, there is Socrates and there is musical Socrates, or this would have been a Heraclitean belief. And there was also, but Aristotle contrasted him, saying that, for example, so there's Socrates and then there's musical Socrates, so there's a change there, which is a Heraclitean belief. But for example, birth, there is no person and person, but he thought that they're just the matter is the same. Person exists in the womb and person exists out of the womb. The form essentially changes. So that's sort of how he combines the two. So there is becoming, there is change, but there is also the existence of the object itself. It just changes, and this is called helomorphism. So, for example, a house is obviously bricks or whatever they would make houses out of there. Probably vast majority of houses were made of clay, but there is the unconstructed house and the constructed house, and the matter is the same, so the matter is a constant, but the form may change. So, and in terms of applying to physics, so he will get to deeper into his physics later, but the object can change through different forms of sort of motion. So there's growth and diminution, which would be like more clay, less clay, more clay, less clay. There could be locomotion, which is change in space. So clay moves forward 5 feet or back 5 feet. So that's locomotion. And there's alteration, which would be a change in quality. So the clay sort of depreciates, which is almost getting close to quantum mechanics. So very much a great deal of forethought in that regards. And then he also believed in this thing of potentiality. And potentiality is that, for example, the bricks have the potential to become house, and that's sort of their ultimate objective. And since the ultimate objective always comes after the original objective, the potentiality exists within it, so they are one and the same. Sort of abstract concepts, but he tackles, and to a very great amount of success, these problems that Parmenides and Heraclitus had posed, that many others, and as you might have seen in previous videos, many others had tried to explain it, but probably not as well as Aristotle did in these examples. So, yeah, for example, in terms of potentiality and actuality, there's the seed has the potential to become a plant, and the eyes have the potential to see, and since that potential always exists, the potential is actually within it. So, becoming is part of being. So, essentially, neither Heraclitus or Parmenides are wrong. In fact, both are right. Becoming and being exist. Also, as I mentioned before, in terms of Plato's universal forms, so Plato believed that there is the universal form of an object, which could be, it could also be spoken in relative terms, like book is next to apple, or it could be book is red. But Aristotle thought, and he thought that was separate from the book itself, but Aristotle thought that they were united as one. The universal form was part of the real form, sort of going back to his concept of matter and form. The potentiality exists within the object itself, and almost getting into sort of nuclear physics, like the energy of an object. Although like E equals mc squared, it's based on obviously the energy of any sort of object with mass exists in it. Just because it's not exploding doesn't mean it does not exist in the first place. So in terms of his natural philosophy, he thought, and here's a little diagram or image, he thought that there's the terrestrial sphere in which we live, and outside of that there's the celestial sphere. And the difference, and the celestial sphere is where the sun and the moon and all the stars live. The difference is that the terrestrial field is changing and corruptible, whereas the sky or the stars and sun and moon are unchanging and uncorruptible. Similar to, and it was Empedocles who first philosophized the concept of the four main elements, that being earth, water, air, and fire. So he also believed in this too. He thought that the heavier objects would be comprised of more earth and less air or fire, for example. And sort of true based on modern chemistry, but we have way more elements than four. So within Earth, we've divided it up into the entire periodic table, or within also water and all of them. But we've just sort of taken the same thing but expanded it further. So here's a little chart, and here's things that he observed. He saw that earth and water were cold, air and fire were hot. They also differed in wet and dryness, but earth and water had a tendency to move down. Air and fire had a tendency to move up. And they sort of have this deconcentration in terms of mass. So in terms of physics, going back to what we were discussing before, he thought that since they have these natural motions, whereas earth goes down, violent motion would be the concept of, like, if you throw a stone, that is not a natural motion. Earth naturally goes down. If you throw it, it goes into violent motion. And he thought that heavier objects require more force. So therefore, force equals mass times volume. And many people thought this was incorrect because it did not for example, if two objects fall, and it was actually Galileo who proved this, this is for he thought, Aristotle hypothesized that for a falling object, the velocity was proportional to its mass, so a heavier object would fall faster, and also proportional to its density. So a less dense object would fall slower, so negatively proportional. And a lot of people thought this was false, especially when Galileo proved it by dropping the two stones off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and they were both different weights, but they fell at the same pace. But the modern, or the revalidation of Aristotle's beliefs, was that he was talking about the density of a fluid. So in a more dense fluid, a heavier object will move faster than a lighter object. So sort of revalidating his formula. So going back to the Parmenidean one, so he thought that Parmenides thought that no void could exist, there could be no vacuum. So therefore, becoming change cannot exist. So Aristotle actually agreed with him on this. So he thought in a vacuum, so going back to his formula, where in less dense places things move faster. So in a vacuum there would be zero density, therefore objects would go infinite speed. So you cannot go infinite speed, so therefore he thought the vacuum could not exist. So obviously not true based on modern physics, but revalidation of Parmenides' point, and a lot of abstract concepts for his time. In terms of optics, so we spent a little bit of research on optics. he set an aperture in a dark room, and he realized no matter how we change the aperture, the sun's beam would still be circular. So minor observation in terms of practical use. It might have had some in terms of probably artistic work or other things of the sort. And he also realized that the further he moved this aperture away, the more it got magnified. So also something that we still use to this day in terms of using microscopes. He saw that in terms of his beliefs on spontaneity, he thought that randomness does exist, which is sort of a quantum mechanics belief, but he thought that there was a different type of randomness, which is called luck. And obviously we have luck today, and luck is sort of based on karma, based on one's own actions. So two differences there. He thought that, and wrongly thought, we spoke about Democritus before, Democritus believed that the Milky Way was caused by the Earth's shadow being caused on other stars. And Aristotle proved him wrong by saying that because the sun was larger than the Earth, and the stars were further away from Earth than the sun was, so therefore it could not be a shadow, which was obviously something true and something that he proved through some of his logic and some of the tools that he uses in his books on logic as well. He observed that in terms of geology, he saw many dried up lakes, and he derived that the world is changing, but many of these changes take place over times that humans cannot observe. So he saw, obviously, that the history of the world had been going on for a long time. He didn't put a specific date on this, but he obviously saw that. But kind of differing in terms of biology, which he had lots of extensive research on, he gets very close to the concept of evolution and Darwinism, and he has many ideas to back it up, but he never really quite touches it. So, as stated earlier, for a while it was thought that Aristotle only was interested in animals, but the thing is, his writings on plants just simply have been lost, whereas his student could be seen studying plants, and they studied pretty much together. So a few of his observations, and that is in regards to octopus or a cephalopodus. So he observed this hectocadal arm, which is the reproductive organ for an octopus, and many people disbelieved this until the 19th century. So perhaps he observed some octopuses procreating, and he managed to find an observance that wasn't been able to be proven for over 1,000 years. So an interesting discovery there. He observed that ovoviviporous, which are animals that only release its eggs when they're ready, in the hound shark, but obviously not an animal. So just another sort of observance, and that was sort of his approach to scientific endeavor. So where he differed from modern scientific discovery, where a hypothesis is created and then a trial is set up to disprove the hypothesis, he sort of just amalgamated a bunch of information and then from there found what is true. And some of these discoveries were that, for example, I'll get to that after. So in terms of going back to what he thought about in terms of evolution, he saw that most animals conveniently seem to fit their environment, and he did think that perhaps they changed over time, but he did not think of anything from a survival of the fittest standpoint. In fact, he almost disagreed with that, saying that many natural occurrences such as droughts and no tsunamis they didn't see, or earthquakes or anything, did not favor the fittest or the healthiest, but were nonetheless causes in terms of changes. But he did believe in the optionality for things to change, and he observed this in, for example, like mules, which are a breed between horses and donkeys. So he did see that there could be sort of genetic deviances, but he did not really believe or prescribe to the survival of the fittest philosophy. And he did not believe in necessarily evolution. He did not observe any extinctions, and this was the survival of the fittest was actually a concept that obviously Darwin came many years before, but this had been hypothesized by Empedocles. So it would he actually had to go out of his way to disbelieve in it, and that's what he did through sort of disproving it, saying that natural occurrences have a large effect on changes. So as stated before, in terms of his experimentation, his came from an amalgamation of data, and from there derived conclusions, rather than vice versa, where a hypothesis is created and one tries to disprove the hypothesis. So just sort of a different approach. Is it wrong? Perhaps it could lead to false conclusions, especially when the effort is not on disproving, but rather on sort of trying to prove. But it nonetheless worked for him, and many true discoveries did come out of this. For example, he realized that brood size, which is like the amount of babies an animal has, is inversely correlated with body mass, which is true. Obviously, elephants have less children than rats, and obviously elephants are a lot bigger. He saw that lifespan and weight were correlated with gestation period, so animals that carry their babies for longer will obviously have longer living and heavier species. He also saw that fecundity, which is the essentially the amount of babies an animal might have over its lifetime, is inversely correlated with its lifespan. So, like humans, we do not have very many babies per person, but we live a very long time, especially given our mass. But obviously there are some exceptions to these rules, so perhaps not the best approach to scientific discovery, but nonetheless it worked, and he did come up with some nice and useful ideas. More specifically, more intensively, he classified 500 animals into a ranking of perfection, or scala naturae, with obviously humans at number 1. And even as we see here, he probably would have classified some humans above others, where he says that barbarians should be seen as beasts or plants. So even within humans, he thought there was a sort of hierarchy there. But obviously, animals of live birth and hot, like warm-blooded and wet, were superior to animals with eggs, and cold animals and dry animals. So that's just sort of a tendency in the hierarchy. So, and that is a way at alluding to mammals, because mammals were all warm-blooded, and he essentially put them in a hierarchy above them. But even within this hierarchy, humans are put at the very top, and they're the only ones with a rational soul. Within that, animals have a sensitive soul, so animals can feel things. If you hit a dog, obviously it reacts and feels it. And then lastly, he puts a vegetative soul, which is the ability to reproduce and to grow. And humans apply to all of these. So there's not one soul, but there are 3 souls. But where he differed actually from most of his contemporaries and earlier thinkers, he actually thought that the soul took place in one's heart, whereas most believed it was in one's brain. So maybe he was observing sort of the pulse, so how a heart sort of spreads throughout the body, or something along those lines. But I also think just the idea of heart, or the concept of heart, is almost just a little bit more beautiful. I think, for example, if someone says they lead their life through their heart versus leading their life through their brain, I think it just sounds a little nicer. Maybe that's just a social construct, but either way, he put it in. He put the souls in the heart rather than the brain. in terms of philosophy, generally speaking, all of these at the time were considered philosophy. So philosophy was just love of thinking. And I was originally going to call this series History of Leaders of Philosophy, but I called it History of Leaders of Thought just because in terms of terminology, philosophy has no longer come to encompass things such as psychology and science. So it's considered a separate category. So I call this History of Leaders of Thought if you are interested. So he thought that war was just, for example. And he thought that slavery was necessary for freedom, and leisure leads to arrogance. So essentially, with this, he thought that firstly, obviously our Eastern philosophers such as Buddha would have not liked this, or Mahavira, in that to not fight is almost a crime in itself, and for people to defend themselves against slavery, whether within your own household or within your own community, it strengthens an individual and causes them to improve or ameliorate themselves and to learn. So he thought that always the threat of slavery was actually good for people, and he thought that it was just for a better people to conquer another people. And he might have been sort of swayed partially because he was so deep into the Macedonian household and Alexander the Great and Philip II, but these were obviously ideas he thought, and he thought that Alexander's efforts in terms of conquering were justified. And where he obviously differed from Alexander, he would have liked it if Alexander probably treated the Persians more poorer than he did. And maybe if he did, maybe the Macedonians would have actually held on longer as conquerors and maybe not fall into the class struggle. But I definitely believe that Alexander the Great was the correct one on this front. So, and yeah, to just kind of close this, that war compels people to be just and temperate, and war must be chosen for the sake of peace. So a state that does not go to war would sort of, when approached by war, would not be ready for it, and would be cast into slavery and never be able to achieve peace. So sort of a fine balance. He thought that ethics should not be necessarily taught as a course, but be taught through a practical purpose. And this is emphasized in his book called Nicomachean Ethics, which is his father's name, Nicomachus. And he thought that throughout one's childhood or upbringing, they must sort of be socialized, and they, in terms of every sort of virtue, one can be, for example, one must look for the mean in all virtues. So, for example, vulgarity is one end of the spectrum, and pettiness is the other end of the spectrum, but generosity sits in the middle. Or one can be a coward. One can be rash, take too many risks, but the mean would be courage, which is in the middle. So he thought, and the only way of doing this, and he thought that it couldn't be like taught necessarily in a course or something like that. You can't read about these things. One must be socialized, so one must deal with a lot of people and must interact. My recommendation for people who do not live in places of high densities, one could also derive these conclusions from literature or just reading about people as well. But nonetheless, he thought it was more of a practical sort of type of learning than it is one of science. In terms of politics, he thought that not only was a city important, but it is natural and organic for people to unite into cities, and it's not it is not necessarily, he says, it is necessary for the whole that they go into larger groups. It's not just for security, or it's not just for economy, but it also yields beauty and art. And this could not be accomplished by oneself unless they are an absolute genius. But when people combine together, they can create great things. So there's other purposes to creating communities as well. But he also thought that the city is more important than the family, which is more important than the individual. So sort of a greater calling to being. He says the political partnership must be regarded, therefore, as being for the sake of noble actions, not for the sake of living together. So there's a higher purpose of living together. And this very much differs from later thinkers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the social contract thinkers, and even Thomas Hobbes, in that the people unite in order to avoid death and violence, and they need to sort of create a government to control them. Otherwise, there would be just a bunch of savages running around. But Aristotle differed in that he thought there was a higher purpose. People unite to create things, to create beauty, and to create virtue. And also, moving back to his ethics, also to socialize people. He thought that in terms of the leader, sort of similar to Plato, as we saw in Republic, that the leader must also be the smartest person. And he thought that it was sort of, firstly, an unintelligent person would not even understand this, but a great leader would recognize that the best thing they can do for their people is to become smarter. And this is probably one of the reasons why Alexander proved to be such a great leader, was because he was actually not, obviously, the greatest or best soldier per se, or even the best general, but he was probably the smartest individual at the time. In my opinion, he probably knew everything Aristotle did, but he was actually able to implement them, and also to a more temperate degree. And also it helped that he was king, so he could actually make these great changes. But that he thought that the best gift a leader can give is their own intelligence. In terms of economics, he was one of the first to actually sort of give an overview of why money is so necessary. And so he thought that people obviously became dependent on each other because as people started getting surpluses, like for example, if they, obviously this didn't happen in Greece, but if a community were to slay a mammoth, they would have had a surplus of this mammoth food. So why not sell the surplus and then buy something later? So he thought that there was a sort of necessity of money, but also he thought that it's in terms of relative buying power, like how many chickens should I sell to buy like a grain of wheat? It would have been very difficult without having a third sort of monetary system, especially considering if you want to sell chickens, the other guy wants to sell wheat, but he wants your chickens, but you want a toothbrush. How are you supposed to get the toothbrush? It would be so difficult to go through three, but that's why it's necessary to have a certain currency. And he thought that retail is unnatural, and he thought because retail's objective is profit, and he thought that the end to commerce should be the not the profit, but rather the actual output. So if you're building a chair, you shouldn't be thinking about the money, you should be thinking about building the best chair possible. But I don't think this is a fully or completely well-grounded idea, because I think the money alone would incentivize building the best chair. But you can't agree with everyone or anyone on everything. So in terms of rhetoric, he was one of the first to really start talking about writing and literature and speaking. So he thought that, or he was the first to hypothesize this, that there was a speaker may use three main strategies. They can use ethos, logos, and pathos. So you've probably heard of this. Ethos would appeal to the speaker's character. So like, I am king, so therefore I am right. Logos, which is logical reasoning, like you know what that would mean. Like, we have less soldiers, they have more soldiers, we will lose. So that is logos. And lastly, pathos, which is the audience's emotions. So like, you've been beaten by these people every year, don't you want to stand up, or something like that. So that would be a pathos, appealing to their emotions. Then also he divided all types of speeches into three categories. So there's the epideictic, which is praise or blame. So that's kind of just like a modern day rant, like, oh, this guy's so good, this guy's so bad. There's forensic, which would be seen in like a court case, where it's like, here are our facts, what can we conclude? and there is deliberative, which is a call for decision, like should we go to war or should we not go to war? So those were the three types of discussions. He also had enthymeme, which is proof by syllogism, and paradigma, which is proof by example. So these are just sort of ways of proving things. So you can prove by anecdote, like obviously you know what an anecdote is, like you tell a small story, which is proof by example, paradigma, and enthymeme, which is proof by syllogism, which is syllogism is just another word for logic. So that's how one might prove something, and that can be used in all the different types of speeches, and that can be used combined with logos, pathos, and ethos. So he thought that all art, whether music, paintings, or sculptures, had what's called a mimesis, which is a sort of, it directly translates to imitation, but it's really the ultimate sort of essence of it. So, for example, listen to song might be happy. That is, and to really understand the music is to get at what the artist is ultimately trying to imitate. So if a song is like, I don't know, sing a happy song, it's ultimately trying to imitate the emotion of happiness. Whereas, so that is, and to understand the mimesis is vital to understanding the overall piece. He thought that, and obviously all structure, no matter how you choose to express it, is just ways of going about this. He saw that he wrote two books. He wrote one on comedy, which is sort of a discussion of people who are below average, and sort of obviously invokes people to laugh on them or perform below average, and tragedy, where someone above average falls. I actually disagree with this. I think there are essentially two major story types. There's the tragedy, where sort of in terms of shape, I'll do it over here so you can see, the individual sort of starts as a or just keeps soaring higher and higher, and then eventually goes down and collapses. And this can be seen in almost like Julius Caesar. You know, he goes up, 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 down. Even in modern examples, Wolf of Wall Street, up, 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 down, and crash. And then there's the hero story, which is sort of starts from the bottom, and then can start from really anywhere, but then they get a challenge. So things go down, 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 challenge. Things going into the depths of hell. Mars or aliens are attacking. Down, 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 down. And then hero succeeds, and then everything's happy. So completely like sort of an inverse. So there's the tragedy and the hero story, which are two inverses. And then a comedy is sort of a third example. You could have a funny tragedy. It could be sort of kind of ironic at the same time. You can have a comedic hero. So I think comedy is sort of separate, but I think those are the two major stories. And within stories, there could be multiple hero stories and multiple tragedies. Like one could be the hero, one could be the tragedy. But either way, he differed on that. But you can't believe everything that everyone says. One of his last discussions is whether an epic or a tragedy is superior. So I guess another one would be like an epic. So for example, Anna Karenina. Obviously, it is ultimately a tragedy, but there are so many different characters, so many different things going on, that it's sort of hard to devise. Ultimately, for her, it is sort of struggle, and then, sorry if there's a spoiler, she kills herself. But it's ultimately a tragedy, the main story, Anna Karenina. But within it, there's other characters. For example, Levin, he's got struggles, and then at the very end, he figures it out. So the epic. But Aristotle posed the question, what is better, the epic or the tragedy? So he was probably comparing something like the Iliad, which is the story of the fall of Troy, to a tragedy. He thought that a tragedy was just more concise, but these probably don't apply to today. I would say that the fall of Troy is kind of like what I was discussing before, is sort of like it's a tragedy for most of the Trojans, but it's a hero story for Achilles. So it's just a big conglomerate of many other themes. But either way, he derived a lot of this from studying Aesop's tales and also the riddles of the Temple of Delphi, which was sort of an autonomous religious source. I suppose it would be the best way of calling it. So, but he read extensively into this literature, and it just shows sort of his breadth of knowledge. So, as you've sort of seen to this point, he covered, politics, he covered physics, he covered botany, he covered pretty much everything under the sun at the time that he could have, and his influence is immeasurable. We'll soon be getting into some Middle Eastern philosophers, such as Averroes, Avicenna, and Alpharabius. So they had a huge influence on Aristotle had a huge influence on them, and they cite him many times, and huge influence on pretty much any philosopher. I would say if any philosopher doesn't know Aristotle, I would probably not even go so far as to call them a philosopher. And any individual who doesn't know Aristotle, I'd be surprised how big that rock they've been living under must be. So, I suppose we'll move to Antisthenes, and we'll talk about him a bit more in the comparison. So, Antisthenes, I usually like to put the individual who was born earlier first, just to kind of have a nice chronological order. But I knew that the Aristotle discussion, or I guess we could call it lecture, would be so long. I wanted to just sort of get through that and move on to Antisthenes in case if something happened, if a train came by, which often does happen. I wanted to get that through so that so I don't have to keep doing Antisthenes over and over and then do Aristotle, which I imagine would be much longer. But Antisthenes, not because he's any less of a great individual, there's just less is known about him because he did not have any specific writings that still last to this day. So he was actually the first of the Cynics. So you might know the word cynicism, which actually had a sort of a different meaning back then, and as we'll see in this discussion, but he was also called the dog, and so were some of his students. So he was originally trained in rhetoric under Gorgias, who was a great rhetorician, employed many of the things that Aristotle later ended up discussing, but after that, he became an ardent supporter of Socrates. So he was also a student of Socrates, and he absolutely loved him. Unlike both Plato and Xenophon, who wrote so much about Socrates, this Antisthenes was actually at Socrates' death, so has a little bit more to say in that regard. He was he lived an extremely ascetic life, so that was something that we saw with mostly Mahavira, who would go so far as to cut his own skin. But we'll get to that when we actually move to more of the philosophy. In terms of his own life, he had a Thracian mother and an Athenian father. So he lived in Athens, but he had to lecture at the Synosarges, which is a gymnasium for individuals whose mothers are foreign-born. So there was obviously a bit of racism at the time. He was not allowed to communicate with or teach the normal intellectuals because of his mother. So not the best times, and Aristotle was probably a supporter of this, because Aristotle, as we saw earlier, was kind of definitely believed in social hierarchies. And also, as I mentioned, didn't mention as much about Aristotle, he also thought that people of higher intelligence were better than people with lower intelligence and should probably breed more, which obviously is a very controversial topic. And Antisthenes sort of got the blunt end of the stick here. So he was famous for his asceticism. So he would try to avoid all pleasures, and that being attaining any wealth, sexual pleasure, or anything like that. Another very famous student of his was Diogenes. So Diogenes was known to live in, and this is not Diogenes Laertius, the historian. This is Diogenes the philosopher. He would live in essentially a large vase, and he would he was extremely poor. But a big part of the aesthetic of cynicism, and this is what cynicism is that they must avoid all pleasure. Like, they don't work, they just beg, they don't accumulate any money. Often, if you come from money, you give up all your money. But it's not just giving up all these pleasures. It's not just you could go out and live in the woods and live off the land, but it's also an important aspect is humiliation. One must be live in a metropolis and be criticized and take the criticisms and think nothing of it, and that is what true cynicism is. He was supposedly Diogenes Laertius, who is the historian, says that he wrote 10 volumes. However, only fragments remain. That's why, unfortunately, there isn't too much to say here. But his style of writing was pure and elegant, and Diogenes says that Plato even stole much in terms of his writing style and maybe even in terms of content. Cicero said that he was a man more intelligent than learned, and Cicero absolutely loved his writing. So from this, it's more intelligent than learned. This is kind of like the formal education is where real intelligence ends. It's that he was so smart, but he did not really get the formal education, probably because he was an outsider and because of his mother's birth. But it said that he was extremely witty. At one point he said he would rather fall among crows than flatterers, because one devours the dead but the other the living. So flattery is essentially saying flattery is not good, and one of the things that cynics would try to avoid. In fact, they would go so far as to upset people, and they did not want to have any supporters because they did not want to get flattery. But ironically, it actually rendered them getting more supporters. And most ironic of all, I think he was famous for wearing a cloak, staff, and a wallet, which is sort of became the uniform of a cynic. But I find the ironic part is they were carrying a wallet, and the concept of money was that they don't hold any money, so I suppose they carried around an empty wallet. So I find that kind of funny, but that's sort of the uniform that he established, being the first of the cynics, and obviously Diogenes ultimately wore it as well. So he thought that virtue can be taught. This is something that also, actually, Aristotle sort of disagreed with to some extent, but it wasn't common belief at this time. He thought that even the homeless, even the ill-bred could be taught to be very virtuous people, and it wasn't just something for the great. And nobility belongs only to the virtuous. So additionally, one could be born from a great family, but could also be non-virtuous. And he thought that virtuous actions was more important than, virtue can only be proven by one's actions. So he thought, going back to cynicism, he thought that ill repute was a good thing, and good like pain. So pain is good, shame is good, and it makes one stronger and smarter. But he thought that one should aim to marry the most beautiful woman and have children. So he thought that sort of love and friendships were okay. It's just don't be eating cheesecake and celebrating and partying all day long. But friendships and relationships were okay. He thought that wisdom was only given also to the virtuous. So virtuous can be taught, but also only the wise are virtuous, and vice versa. So wisdom comes from virtue, which comes from avoiding all pleasure. So this is another earlier individual who practiced asceticism was Pythagoras. So Pythagoras started a cult, and you can see this in a previous video. It's not referenced whether Antisthenes was directly inspired by Pythagoras, and he did not build a cult like Pythagoras did, but he did practice a strict way of living. So somewhat of a parallel there. He thought that, which was kind of an uncommon, but we're starting to see more and more philosophers who believe in this, that there was only one God and that they resemble nothing from earth. So as Xenophon said, if there was a God, if horses had a God, God would look like horse. So we thought that was kind of strange that our gods happen to look like humans. So, and he thought that could not be understood through representation because nothing on earth looks like God. So I don't know what your stance on God is, but that's probably how I perceive God. But yeah, he believed that. So he's sort of different from Plato as well, similar to Aristotle, saying, and once again, sorry to get into these very abstract concepts, but I hope you're following along. There's the horse and the universal horsehood. So Plato thought there was the actual object itself and its universal category. But he thought this was sort of circuitous thinking. For example, saying like a tree and a vegetable growth are two different things is the same thing as saying a tree is a tree. So he thought it was cyclical thinking, and a simpler way of opposing Plato's thoughts than Aristotle did. But once again, even he had the guts to speak up and against Plato, and that's probably one of the reasons why he succeeded in gaining a lot of support, was that he wasn't afraid to upset people and speak out against the most famous. So the word cynic did not exist during his time, or perhaps it did, but it has not. There's no writing of the word cynic until much later, and even Aristotle himself referred to the followers of Antisthenes as the Antisthenians. So that would have been the old Cynic term, and perhaps Diogenes was Antisthenian. And yeah, so Diogenes lived in a jar, and supposedly he even followed Antisthenes around like a hound. And it's kind of funny because Antisthenes was considered a dog himself, so this is probably a reference to their way of life where they lived on pretty much scraps. And here's Diogenes even with dogs, so the Cynics are kind of related to dogs, but I don't think they took a lot of shame in this. I think they sort of appreciated dogs and saw them as a noble species. The symbol of Cynics was Hercules. They thought Hercules was the perfect example of a Cynic, in that although Hercules became so powerful, he never actually strove for wealth, and also very, very much lived a life of hardship. But also, cynicism didn't just apply to avoiding all pleasures and living a tough sort of spiritual life. It also required rigorous training, physical training. He thought that there were sort of twofolds in terms of asceticism, and one must sort of work out and exercise and get super strong and be strong in terms of body, but strong in terms of mind too. And additionally, it said that he was also one of the reasons why Diogenes is considered to have been a student of Antisthenes was because Diogenes taught Crates, and Crates ultimately yielded Stoicism. So it's said that maybe the Stoics just tried to make this connection, but nonetheless, Antisthenes was probably one of the first Cynics, or the first to sort of inspire this way of life, and Diogenes did a very similar sort of thing. So the Cynicism sort of lasted for quite a long time. It lasted until the Roman Empire, where many Cynics could be in the streets begging, and in their scampy clothes, and even fortunately or unfortunately, it sort of ended up dying. But then sort of asceticism sort of picked up again, and sort of Christianity, as you can see with particularly, for example, Martin Luther was practiced asceticism, even self-torture, and sort of picked up. And it's been a common theme that we've seen throughout many of these lives. Like Mahavira would practice asceticism, he would fast all the time, and he would even go so far as to body mutilation. It's not explicit what he did in body mutilation, but I think it probably had to do with maybe skinning himself or something of the sort, or maybe tattoos or something like that. But it's always been a sort of, a lot of individuals have sort of derived that to reach a certain level of philosophical state, one must make severe sacrifices. And perhaps this is, and I think a lot of, for people who did not have access to drugs, for example, if you don't have LSD, try not eating for 10 days. You'll start seeing some stuff so it's always been a sort of common common occurrence. He was considered, the Cynics were considered the first cosmopolitans, in that they thought that man was a citizen of the world. So they thought that all people were, it didn't really matter where someone came from. It didn't really matter what they looked like. They were all, should be treated equally. It didn't matter if the guy's living in a jar. It didn't matter what they were wearing. Everyone is sort of equal. And this very much differs from Aristotle, as we will see in the comparison, which I will begin right now. So in terms of similarities, they both had great teachers. Aristotle's Plato, Antisthenes had Socrates, but they both had the guts to oppose great thinkers in some ways. Aristotle didn't really directly oppose Plato too much, but he had the guts to speak out against his master, and as did Antisthenes. And Antisthenes had the guts to sort of oppose pretty much everyone in Athens at the time. In terms of their differences, I think there are many, and I think it's nice that these two are both paired up here. Many of these pairings are actually mostly just because chronologically they came so close to each other, but it actually leads to nice comparisons, as we can kind of see how things have slowly changed over the time. But obviously Aristotle was sort of a racist, and he loved war, and he thought that, obviously he didn't believe in too much profit or anything like that, but he believed in slavery, and he believed in the power surpassing the weak, whereas Antisthenes believed that sort of everyone was equal, and not only should people not look down upon each other, but people should put themselves down. So very much extremes in this regards. But another difference is that Aristotle did cover a lot more topics, but that does not, I would say, make him a better person than Antisthenes. Antisthenes might have been morally superior, whereas Aristotle might be intellectually superior, depending on what your definition of intellect. Who was wiser? I guess that's sort of your decision. But yeah, that is Aristotle and Antisthenes. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you might watch the ones I will make in the future and ones that I've made in the past. Thanks so much. Bye.